Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 46th episode of 2024, and actually, I think our 202nd episode so far. So, before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. Congress returned to Washington this week for its lame duck session with a long to-do list that will certainly be influenced by the change in administration and leadership in the Senate. We're also waiting to see who's going to end up controlling the House, although it does look like the Republicans are on their way to controlling that chamber as well. So leadership elections will kick off this week, both in the House and Senate, and the outcomes will certainly influence the agendas for the 119th Congress. There's also a short window to pass several must-pass pieces of legislation before the end of the session, including funding bills for the government. But for us, we're focused on the Farm Bill that's yet to be addressed and includes RUS and Reconnect. Last week, we held our final Regional Fiber Connect workshop of 2024 in Albuquerque, and it was phenomenal. It was great to hear from Patricia Dominguez, the State Director for Rural Development for USDA, Drew Lovelace, the New Mexico's Broadband Director, and the tribal leaders discussed the broadband plans for the state and for tribal communities. We also greatly appreciated the remarks from Senator Lujan's office. Next up is the Fiber Broadband Association's premier member meeting in Florida, December 9th and 10th, where we'll be discussing and setting our strategy for 2025. Now that 2024 is largely behind us, we have rolled out our Regional Fiber Connect regional workshop schedule for 2025. We're going to start in San Antonio in February. We'll be in Philly in March. We'll have Fiber Day on the Hill in April. Our Granddaddy Fiber Connect 2025 annual conference will be in Nashville, June 1 to 4, and that is going to be amazing. We've spent a lot of time working on that, and we're really taking it up to the next level. Then we'll be in Anchorage in July, Toronto in August, back in Scottsdale, Phoenix area in October, and then Kansas City in November, and then we'll have our premier member meeting in Palm Springs, December 8th and 9th. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session. Our guest today is our good friend, Mark Bridger from Continuum Capital and the Fiber Broadband Association's Vice President of Workforce Development and Research, Debbie Kish, who's going to be they'll be sharing the latest National Workforce Research Study, FBA PCCA Workforce Study, who will get the work done as BEAD money begins to flow. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris. Our team is going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us. We appreciate it. Before I go over some logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if everyone would please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today, but to ask a question, you can type it into the question box, which is located in the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will have a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation will also be recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please do take a moment to do so. We appreciate your input. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to introduce our panelists and get things started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber Breakfast, our guest was our good friend and top research partner, Mike Render, the CEO and Principal Analyst at RVA, who shared his latest annual consumer study research, getting even more from fiber for what service providers should do to amplify and augment the advantage. If you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today in Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is our good friend, Mark Bridger from Continuum Capital, and Debbie Kish, the Fiber Broadband Association's VP of Workforce Development. And they're going to share the latest research on the National Workforce Research Study, FBA PCCA Workforce Study, who will get the work done as BEAD money begins to flow. So Mark Bridger has extensive experience within the energy and utility markets. He primarily works with utilities, utility engineers, and utility contractors in the areas of organizational analysis, construction cost management, accounting, and financial issues and strategy development. He's an avid researcher and speaker with over 20 years of experience consulting to the overhead and underground utility construction industry. He's the primary author in multiple industry papers and research study. He's has an undergraduate degree from Clemson, an MBA from Darden. Mark also works extremely closely with our friends at PCCA, the Power and Communications Construction Association. This is a fantastic organization run by Tim Wagner. Just a great group of industry professionals that's actually doing the hands-on construction of our nation's power and communications infrastructure. We share a lot of joint members from both organizations, and it's just a huge privilege whenever I'm invited to join the PCA events and meetings. Tim and PCCA are truly amazing group of folks. Debbie is our Vice President of Workforce Development and Research. She leads our education, training, workforce development, and research initiatives. And prior to FBA, she had 20 years as an analyst at Gartner. So welcome, Mark and Debbie. And for audience, please type in your questions to the go. And with that, I will turn things over to Mark, get things started.
Gary, thank you very much, and I appreciate the fine introduction. I want you to know I got up an extra hour early this morning. I jogged a mile, and I had a bowl of Raisin Bran and yogurt in honor of Fiber for breakfast. So I feel like I'm fully committed. All righty. David, you'll move to the second page. Basically, what I'm going to try to do is to give everybody an overview of this recent research that was sponsored by FBA and PCCA. The objective of it was very straightforward, and there's not anything out there in the industry that gets at this, but to define and forecast and prioritize what the broadband market was going to look like over the next 5 to 7 years in each of the states. And there were three things that we were looking at. What is the demand for services from a construction and a technician standpoint? What's the available workforce supply? And then lastly, what are the wage rates for staff that are working both in the field and the office in those construction or technician roles? The results of the study were released in July via a press conference at the Fiber Connect event. And we've been doing some things to try to make the study more visible and readily available. There's a slide at the end of the presentation today that'll offer you a link as to where you can download the study. There's also some information on training resources for individuals and organizations that are looking for trained and capable individuals to try to answer the question of who will do the work. David, you can move forward one. So in terms of highlights, the study demonstrated that COVID-19 exposed a substantial gap in terms of high-speed broadband access. I'm one of those individuals that was exposed. We have high-speed internet here at the house, but during COVID, my wife and I were both running our businesses from home, and we had two children both trying to participate in school all at the same time, and we did not have enough of high-speed access in order to service all four of us online at the same time. And so we ended up having to upgrade the service in order to meet that. There are plenty of people around the country that ran into a similar problem and have been trying to solve it since that time period. The BEAD funding is one of those tools that's designed to solve that. When we started this research, we began with the idea that this federal and state funding would serve as a rising tide and all boats would be raised. What we discovered, however, is that is not going to be the case. There are some significant challenges associated with actually accessing this money. And as is alluded to here on this page, there are multiple entities that we spoke with who are concerned about the bureaucracy and perhaps don't have the staffing in order to address running through the challenge process and some of the other characteristics that are required, and have decided not to pursue some of that federal money or some of that state money in some instances. Also, there has been a significant attraction of private equity into this market space. And I've got a page later that talks about some of the private equity companies that have come in. But I want to position this idea with you that the private equity companies have entered this space because they view the federal and the state funding as free financing. And in contrast to what financing would cost in the open market, it's a significant differential. Also, they see long-term and frankly unrelenting demand for high-speed wireless and high-speed wired service, and that's something that we're in agreement is going to continue for the foreseeable future. David, you can move on again. The other thing that's taking place is there's a series of disruptions that are happening. Those of you in states that did not have broadband offices before the funding was passed in 2022 have seen those offices formed. They are the vehicle that's going to distribute the federal funding at the state level. And that's occurred in all 50 states. And that's something that has been disruptive in terms of how are they going to implement that? What are the rules that are going to be used to distribute the funding? These are all things that are being designed in real time. This is a massive injection of funding into this market. Just to give you a frame of reference, there's a slide later that shows that there's $80 billion worth of federal funding that has been earmarked for this space. The typical spending in this market from a pure construction standpoint in a given year is somewhere in the 20 to 25 billion dollar range. And so you're talking about putting a significant amount of spend on top of what is already a significant and growing routine and regular activity. Also, you're seeing a ramp up of construction activity of all types. I'm sure that any of you who've been following the news have heard all of this discussion about data centers. Data centers are one of the biggest consumers of fiber install and fiber capacity around the country right now. And they're one of the things that's necessary in order to make cloud computing and streaming possible for each of us. That's something that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. And then I already mentioned about the private equity coming into the space, but they are playing a role in the formation of ILECs and CLECs in some instances. They are rolling up engineering companies and they're rolling up some construction companies. If you go to the next page for me, David. The companies that are playing a role in this space from a private equity standpoint, this is simply a short list of them. But again, they're viewing this federal and state financing or funding as free financing for their growth efforts in this market space. And this is something that you're likely going to see continue. You can go ahead and Dave. On this next page, we've got a breakdown of the spending into the different categories. This is just at the state level. This also does not take into account routine and regular spending that is occurring. This is money that is being poured on top of the routine and regular activity. Our estimate is that once this funding starts to roll out and becomes more consistent, you're going to see an additional $10 to $12 billion in spending occurring on a national basis year in, year out. You can go ahead, Dave. From a construction and workforce standpoint, the calculations that were made demonstrate that there's a minimum of 28,000 for construction trade additions that are needed just to address the special funding. Over the next 10 years, there's another 55 to 56,000 who are likely going to retire and will have to be backfilled for. These numbers do not take into account project management, design, locator, owner representative, inspection, and other resources that are critical to ensure that construction can take place. And again, this growth is on top of normal and routine growth that's happening in the industry that is underlying the additional federal and state funding. From a technician standpoint, we've anticipated an additional 30,000 that's needed. There's going to be approximately 63,000 who are likely to retire over the next 10 years and will have to be backfilled for. And then, of course, regular and routine growth. There are a host of bottlenecks that have already become visible that are delaying the funding and it getting out. And as you get closer to the point of construction, there's a waterfall chart that we'll show in a moment that kind of speaks to what's going on there in terms of the delays. But these delays are going to show up from a design standpoint, a permitting standpoint, a locating standpoint, and then, of course, they're going to be construction and technician bottlenecks once you get deeper into the process. You can move forward, David. This page gives a breakdown of the workforce need. I've already touched on most of these topics, and so these materials are going to be available, but this gives you a breakdown on a position by position basis. David, you can move forward again. The waterfall chart here breaks down what's occurring from a delay and a challenge standpoint. And so this is once you get beyond the states figuring out who the money might go to, and then the submission of the programs and the acceptance of those programs. But you've got a market space that is set up to design the current activity. Pouring this additional money onto the market means that the design functions are not set up to service that. That's one of the reasons that private equity has begun to look at trying to roll up some of the design service providers and then get access to that design work as part of that roll-up strategy to meet this demand that is going to happen. As you move deeper into the process, you've got permitting issues. Those of you who are involved in the construction process will know that the permitting process has become much more challenging over the last 10 to 15 years. And there are many instances where permitting authorities, which are typically municipalities and counties, are pushing responsibility for city or county infrastructure onto the builders of utility infrastructure. That's something we anticipate continuing to occur. And then the staffing at these permitting facilities are not set up to deal with this bubble of construction activity that's going to occur. As you get deeper into this process, you've got locating challenges, you're going to later have construction challenges, and then technician challenges in terms of the available workforce. One of the positive things, we are still probably a year or more away from high-level construction activity across much of the U.S., and so there is time to begin to try to address some of these challenges going forward. David, you can go forward again. So some of the delays that are occurring, we've already kind of talked about this, so I'm going to skip over this page. And then the next page gives a breakdown of wages. And I've got a simplistic comparison at the national level. In the study that's available, these figures are replicated on a state-by-state basis for comparison purposes. Those of you who are not familiar with how this information is typically presented, the study data is in the first three columns, which are the study national low end, the median, and the high end. And the Bureau of Labor and Statistics comparison at the national level is on the far right. Keep in mind that the study is specific to telecom, broadband, and technician workspace, and the BLS study covers all construction activity. And so that picks up different types of construction activity that's occurring that might have different pay rates in those alternative construction segments. But you can see here, there's not a single position at the median level that falls below $40,000 a year. For those of you who are not familiar, the average wage that someone would get from a technical college who then might come into the technician or the construction workforce is in the 36,000 range. The numbers that are shown here far exceed that figure. What's not reflected here is overtime, which could be as much as 15 to 30% for most of these positions, and might be as much as 50 to 100% for some of the critical field positions. And also fringes and other benefits are not incorporated into these wages. And in comparison to the BLS data, those items are incorporated into the BLS data. You can go ahead, David. So this brings me to where you can get the study. And so I'll leave this page up, and then there's a page for a few moments while we talk about it. And then there's a page after this that shows where some of the training resources are for individuals and organizations that are implemented in that training. So with that, Gary, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, I think I'll pass it over to Debbie. I think she has some comments to make. And also I had Kiana put the a link to the study in the chat so people can grab it there.
Yeah, so thanks Gary, and thanks Mark. So we see the estimation of somewhere, to back Mark's data up, we see the estimation of somewhere between 60 and 65% of our workforce being on the retirement path. Those are people in the 40 plus age range, and largely 50 plus, unfortunately. So I'd like to point out that this study really emphasizes the number of people we'll need, not just over the next 5 years, but on an ongoing basis because of that large number of people set to retire. With the BEAD projects, slated to start in 2025, for the fiber industry, this really means that we desperately need a skilled workforce that will build, maintain, and operate fiber networks. And a critical component of that is training. So fiber technicians need specialized skills in areas like fiber splicing, testing, and troubleshooting, but also ensure that the work is done correctly and efficiently rather than fast and wrong. So when we consider programs like our Optic Path Fiber Optic Tech training course, we're not just equipping new candidates with essential skills, we're also empowering experienced technicians to further develop their expertise. So essentially, Optic Path is committed to fostering a skilled workforce that delivers high quality work and builds sustainable careers in the fiber industry. I've been emphasizing that the need for skilled technicians for network operations can't be overlooked because operations overlaps with BEAD construction. Optic Path prepares technicians for careers in both. My point is that it's important to get training initiatives going now, arguably a year ago, so that we can proactively address the current workforce shortage and ensure the future of our industry. As the title of this Fiber for Breakfast webinar, which by the way, it's fun joining Fiber for Breakfast again. I haven't done this in a while, but who will get the work done? My answer would be those who put training as a priority. So I should also mention that we align with community colleges and learning institutions that have adjacent programs like pole climbing and ditch digging and things like that that are more on the construction side. But as you see, and as Mark pointed out, the construction side also has a significant need for workers. In fact, OpticPath trains for at least 3 positions on the construction field side and 6 on the technicians side positions. So those are my comments, and I'll pass it back to Gary. Thanks.
Well, Mark, Debbie, a lot of great stuff, and a couple of comments. Mark mentioned, kind of position BEAD is really driving a lot of private equity, but BEAD is targeting 8.8 million households. We have about 140 million households across the nation, and we have fiber to around half of those. So, so BEAD actually is only, all the government subsidies are just like a 10% of what's the actual investment in being in fiber and across the nation. So it's a great catalyst, but there's so much work beyond BEAD, 10 times more work beyond BEAD that's happening here in the next several years. So that's great. And Debbie, congratulations to you and your team on, you started with a cohort of 18 students a couple of years ago. We got 225 last year. We will have 1,085 by the end of this year, and we'll get into 10,000. So getting people trained has really been doing great. So there's a ton of questions. Let me start with, do you have any wages report in your presentation that get funneled into the Davis-Bacon labor wage?
So the Davis-Bacon basically is a prevailing wage, kind of a structure. And so that factors into the wages that were reported. And I didn't really describe this, but the information that was used to calculate the wages came directly from the employers at the operator level and at the contractor level. And so their pay rates are the pay rates incorporated in there take into account Davis-Bacon or prevailing wage when that is applied on a given year basis.
And then, are you, Debbie, and this might be for you, but are you aware of any funding for companies that perform outside plant construction, but also have in-house training centers, which includes climbing and construction technicians?
So there are state programs that I know that are available. So depending on where you are, there are state funded programs depending on, again, where you are.
All right. And then let's see here. Tons of questions here. Do you see, okay, this is an administration question. Any risk of funding being released with the new administration coming in 2025? So we get.
So that's a question that everybody's kind of curious about.
Yeah.
And so my view on it is that these, the infrastructure bill that was passed 2 years ago, and then this BEAD funding and some of the other funding, those are bills in Congress. And so it would take a alternative bill to undo them. And so you've got something where you'd have to have the Senate and the House, and then of course, incoming President Trump or outgoing President Biden sign that into law in order for some substantial change to take place. I'm actually hopeful, however, that as with every type of federal legislation, there is a rulemaking process that occurs. And it's that rulemaking process that in many instances is the bureaucracy that it slows down or changes or impacts the way that the funding will take place. I'm optimistic that the Trump administration might actually take some action to adjust some of the rulemaking that then might help this funding move forward faster. We are believers that this funding should already be in the market and should have been in the market for a year, but that has not taken place, and it's been moving very slowly. And these delays that we were describing on the waterfall chart, we see those impacting it as well. And we'd rather be in front of those delays rather than behind those delays. And so, again, I'm optimistic that some of the rulemaking might be altered with the new administration.
Yeah, I mean, we have 55 of 56 states that already have initial proposals approved. The grant windows are already open. So the ship sailed. So these things are happening as we speak. Every state broadband office I talked about is they're trying to break ground when the snow thaws in the spring. And so this is happening 2025. And as Mark mentioned, the new administration is going to be a lighter regulatory touch. And so all the actions would help to streamline and enable more companies to be able to participate and really move things faster. So I think it's all net positive from that perspective. One of the questions came in this, when you look at the study, it looks like it ignored the workforce necessary for delivering 30% of the spend, which is tool makers, machinists, engineers, shop floor employees, sales, organizational needs. Any thoughts, comments on that?
Yeah, that's not listed, but that's additional workforce. In the simplest sense, if you take the 30,000 or 28,000 construction crews and you divide that number by 4 or 5 in order to figure out how many crews there are, each of those crews will then need a piece of equipment in order to operate. We'll need a truck, we'll need a lowboy, a generator, so forth and so on. And so all of that material and equipment has to be built, has to be manufactured, has to be sold, has to be integrated into those crews. And so that's not reflected in the study, but that's a multiplier in terms of the workforce need that's going to be necessary.
All right, and then of course there's some Starlink questions on is Leo going to disrupt the construction here? Obviously the bipartisan infrastructure law is about building critical infrastructure, and the way that NTI's waterfall works is you prioritize fiber, get fiber where you can, then you go to fixed wireless, and then there's an alternative technology, some proposed language that would include unlicensed wireless and LEOs, and that is at the edge cases. So again, that's kind of I wouldn't get over rotate on that. It just got a lot of election rhetoric discussion. What about data? So there's as-built data in both the pipeline and utilities. There are data models with. Is there something that's let's see. Is there a common data model for new fiber that's being standard in the industry? And is there a data audit compliance from the Fed or state levels where post-construction data will need to be submitted on fiber projects?
Yes, so I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's actually state specific, where there's no requirement at the federal level that I'm aware of in terms of data submission. But at the state level, that could be a rule that the states would set, because each state has the latitude to set their own rules in terms of the tracking and monitoring of the fiber that gets installed.
All right. Well, let me see here. What about is there so when we did our annual, we do an annual deployment cost study, and labor is somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the cost of any project. Is there a way to mitigate some of the workforce challenges?
Yeah, so as an example, Continuum is working on a AI-driven improvement in production and efficiency and safety in the field. And so just to give you some ballpark numbers, if you were to look at output versus employment in the construction industry over the last 25 years, there's literally no improvement in production on a person versus output basis. And so if you contrast that with other industries like the service industry, there's been dramatic improvement in efficiency through the application of technologies, and artificial intelligence and machine learning is likely going to accelerate that. We think that there's significant opportunity to mitigate some of the workforce need by applying AI tools and machine learning tools with construction crews. And so the idea there is, we're looking at it in 3 ways. One, how do you make it possible for an existing crew or a newly formed crew to get more output out of the day, the week, the month that they're working? Secondly, how do you take individuals who have average skills and experience and then augment that skill and experience to have them perform at a superior level using AI and machine learning? And then third, how do you increase the percentage of the workforce that can perform certain challenging physically or challenging technical tasks? And AI and machine learning is one of the ways to increase the percentage of the workforce that can perform those challenging tasks. We think there's great upside in that, and that's one of the ways that could potentially mitigate some of this workforce need over the next decade.
All right, and last question. So I was just in New Mexico last week, and so a question from a New Mexico engineering civil works shop that says, how do I consult to receive invitations to tenders and be able to offer micro trenching services? I would suggest you work with Drew Lovelace and the broadband office to make sure that everybody's aware of your services. But Mark, do you have any suggestions?
I do. So as an example, FBA has members in all 50 states. Those members are potentially buyers of those services. PCCA on their website has a list of members working in each of the 50 states. And so somebody who's looking for the delivery of that micro trenching service, which would typically be a subcontracted service to most contractors, they can approach the PCCA member companies that operate in the state of New Mexico or the surrounding states and offer that as a subcontract service, for those firms that are performing a broader suite of services in the broadband or fiber space.
Well, and I agree that you should definitely be a member of PCCA if you're in that industry, because as you guys like to say, the bar talk is, and I don't know anybody with more ear to the ground information on what's really happening than PCCA members, because you guys, definitely hear the bar talk. So,
well, they're doing the work, Gary. And so,
yeah, exactly. So you guys
they've got the dirty hands and the dirty boots to show for it.
Yep. All right. Well, Mark and Debbie, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Mark, you always do such fantastic research, and I really love hearing you speak and sharing your knowledge. Debbie, thanks for everything that you do to really advance workforce development in the fiber industry. And I look forward to getting back together next week. We're going to be with Pomora Fanyal, the former FCC chief economist, and Coleman Brazilian of Brattle Research, to discuss their latest research on the economic benefits of fiber deployment. And what makes this so unique is a one-of-a-kind study where you're looking at fiber versus other high-speed technologies. So you're not going to want to miss that, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Gary. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Mark.